In April of this year, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, dissenting in the RNC v. DNC case, stated, quote, "Either they, the voters, will have to brave the polls, endangering their own or others' safety, or they will lose their right to vote through no fault of their own. That is a matter of utmost importance to the constitutional rights of Wisconsin citizens, the integrity of the state's election process, and in this most extraordinary time, the health of the nation." With the backdrop of the most important election of our lifetimes, conducted amidst the pandemic and without the protection of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, welcome to the 5th Annual State of Voting Rights panel, sponsored by the American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. My name is Jason Abel, Special Counsel to the section, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this panel today. We are honored to have 3 brilliant and forceful advocates join us today. And before I introduce them, I wanted to thank and acknowledge the amazing staff of the American Bar Association for making this panel and all the other excellent panels produced by our section a reality. Paula, Allie, and Ruchika, thank you for all you do. Your tireless efforts are a reason our section is able to provide such valuable services to the public and the legal community. Additionally, I'd also like to thank the section's current chair, Angela Scott, and last year's chair, Wendy Mariner, for their leadership during these uncertain times. A couple of housekeeping notes. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you do not see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of the panel. We will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely through your networks. Now to our panel. We only have an hour today, as these folks' day jobs are, needless to say, extraordinarily hectic, and we are grateful for their time. My introductions will not do their important careers justice, but you all came to hear them speak, not me. First, we have Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Kristen has been at the helm of Lawyers Committee for almost 5 years now, I believe, and has been at the forefront of civil rights battles in courtrooms and in the halls of Congress. Prior to Lawyers Committee, Kristen worked on voting rights issues at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. I believe this may be her 3rd time she has personally participated in this particular panel, so we thank her for her time. Next is Terry Almenis, Senior Director of the Census and Voting Programs for Asian Americans Advancing Justice. She has been leading the charge addressing issues arising from the 2020 census, including the attempted addition of a citizenship question, and currently co-chairs the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights Census Task Force. Terry also leads AAJC's voting rights work and has been counsel on numerous Supreme Court amici briefs. Finally, Terry is part of the ABA family, having been appointed to the ABA Standing Committee on Elections this year. Finally, we are pleased to be joined by Thomas Saenz, President and General Counsel of MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Thomas has had a long and illustrious career at MALDEF, advocating for voting rights, education rights, and immigrants' rights. He took a 4-year break from MALDEF from 2005 to 2009 to serve as counsel to then Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. Earlier in his career, he led a successful challenge against California's Prop 187 and has consistently been a force behind efforts challenging other discriminatory laws. So without further ado, we'll start the panel, and I will turn it over to Kristen, who will give her remarks. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that introduction, and thanks to the ABA for creating space for this really timely discussion. 2020 has been quite a year when it comes to voting rights and challenges with respect to accessing the ballot amid the pandemic. So a real honor to be here, and always great to be with my fellow colleagues, Tom and Terry, who are such leaders in this space. I thought that I would start off on a high note and talk about very briefly my time in Selma, Alabama this year. Every 5 years, there are many voting rights advocates and leaders who make the journey back to Selma, Alabama to reenact that historic march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it's interesting, this year's march kind of happened right on the eve of the pandemic really breaking. It was historic in every respect, but perhaps what was most striking about this year's reenactment of the horrendous Bloody Sunday March was that the late John Lewis made a surprise appearance. And I recall kind of just hundreds of people being jam-packed on the bridge. And the rumors started to spread that John Lewis would make an appearance, and he sure enough did, battling pancreatic cancer. And he stood on a small stool that somebody magically whipped up out of nowhere. And he reached his hand up into the sky, and the crowd hushed. And he said, "Go out and vote like you've never voted before." It's been a dark and challenging year for most of us, but for me, that truly was a highlight. We lost a giant when John Lewis passed. And I think for so many of us who do this work, we seek to carry out his legacy and his life's work each and every day. And 2020 has been a challenging moment indeed to carry forth this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pandemic, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will be also talking about the pandemic and how it's made voting incredibly difficult this season. But what I actually want to talk about is the Band-Aid that has been ripped off by the pandemic. I think that the pandemic, has had a tremendous impact on all of us. But with respect to this conversation, I think it's ripped the Band-Aid off and exposed how fractured our electoral system is across the country. We've got 50 states that all approach voting in such different and dramatically varying ways. And, just depending on what state you're in really shapes and dictates how easy it has been to vote amid the ongoing pandemic. In some states, fear of COVID is not a basis to get access to an absentee ballot. In other states, you've got officials who are saying, you know what, skip the absentee ballot application. We're just mailing the absentee ballot to all of the actively registered voters on file and making it as easy as possible. In some states, you've got to get your absentee ballot notarized by a public notary if you want it to count. In others, you've got to get it witnessed by 2 people. In some states, like Tennessee, it is a crime to disseminate absentee ballot applications. So I think that this year is one, as we have kind of litigated to beat back a lot of the unnecessary hurdles and challenges that voters face when it comes to accessing the ballot. I think it's a year that really just has exposed the need for us to create more uniformity in our electoral system. And I think that the way that comes about is by Congress stepping in and filling that void by passing a lot of the election reforms that have been pushed and championed for many years. Things like no excuse absentee balloting, things like same-day voter registration, things like mandating online voter registration. There are only about 40 states where you can register to vote online. Once we catch our breath from this moment, I'm hoping that we can take some of the lessons learned about the dramatically different experiences that voters have had and take that and do some work to see if we can get Congress to help put in place some rules and principles that might make our system a bit more uniform and even across the board. It is just patently unfair, some of the tremendous barriers that vulnerable communities, especially Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, low-income communities, and others, it has been striking to see the barriers that people have had to cross to vote this season. In terms of litigation, there is lots of it, and all 3 of our respective organizations have been on the front lines in working to beat back access. We're working to ensure access to the ballot, but I see litigation kind of on 2 tracks this season. One, there are the cases that have been about lifting the barriers and lifting the hurdles that people face when it comes to voting. On the other side, we have operatives, I will call them, who have really been very aggressive about using the courts as venues to restrict and roll back access to the ballot. And a lot of those efforts have not been successful. We've seen a lot of quiet suits filed in states like Virginia, where they tried to deny people access to absentee ballots on the eve of the primary election. We've seen unsuccessful litigation in California challenging the governor's very progressive move of mailing absentee ballots to active registered voters. And we've also seen some interesting strategies. We actually just beat back a suit that was filed very quietly in a local court in Georgia seeking to purge thousands of eligible voters from the rolls in Fulton County, Georgia. A case that was kind of very, very quietly filed, and I think that was intentionally so, but indicates a kind of new strategy afoot of using, going outside and beyond the federal courts to make voting harder. I want to pivot next to coming back to John Lewis. One of his last acts in Congress was presiding over a House vote that would restore the Voting Rights Act. And I know that many participants are likely aware of the Voting Rights Act, but with a Supreme Court nomination afoot, I will just underscore that one of the most devastating blows that we've seen from this court in the last several years has been the Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder ruling, which brought to a grinding halt a core provision of the Voting Rights Act that had long required that certain parts of our country that have long and egregious histories of voting discrimination to get approval, largely by the Justice Department, before they could put those new voting rules into effect. And since the Supreme Court issued that ruling, we've just seen rampant voter suppression across the country, but the court left the door open for Congress to respond and do work to restore the Voting Rights Act. And so the late John Lewis presided over a vote. A bill was passed that would indeed restore the act, and sadly it stalled in the Senate. But I think that that is a huge threat to democracy, and it's one of the reasons that's made 2020 such a challenging season, because we have seen states not just failing to lift barriers for voters, but proceeding with voter suppression efforts on top of it. States that have put in place ID rules, states that are purging voters from the rolls, states that are shutting down polling sites and not thinking about the impact on historically marginalized communities. When you open up the newspapers, you'll see that the headlines often bring up lots of the same states: Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Florida. And that's not accidental. These were all states that were subject to coverage and protection under that core provision of the Voting Rights Act that we direly need restored. As I wrap up, I'll just briefly mention a disappointing order that came out of the US Supreme Court last night that put in place a stay on a decision made by the Ninth Circuit to block the Trump administration's efforts to curtail the 2020 census count. This is a case that challenged the administration's 11th hour attempt to cut short the 2020 census count. The administration kind of out of nowhere announced that they, despite the pandemic, did not want to proceed through October 31st with counting people across our country. They wanted to cut it short in September, and we went to court. Many of us have gone to court to challenge that action. And we at some point in the litigation, the administration moved the goalpost and said, well, we'll go to October 5th. And we got a district court judge, Judge Koh, to put in place a preliminary injunction that blocked those curtailment plans and that required that the administration continue the count amid the pandemic through the end of October. The Ninth Circuit left that preliminary injunction in place. But yesterday, the Supreme Court, without offering justification or reasoning, blocked that preliminary injunction. And the Census Bureau has now announced that the count will end tomorrow. And this could have devastating implications for those who care about access to democracy. Full and accurate census data is not just critical for ensuring fair allocation of federal funding. This is the data that's used as the building blocks for redistricting, the hard work that lies on the other side of 2020. We know through efforts over time that the hardest to count communities are often children and low-income families, Black people and Latinos, people experiencing homelessness, and the Census Bureau's efforts to knock on doors and make in-person contact with people who are often historically undercounted are critical to achieving that goal, that constitutional goal of having real, fair, and accurate census data that truly represents a count of all people in our country. So this was a blow, but one with a silver lining. We were successful in getting 2 more weeks out of this administration than we otherwise would have gotten. And the battle continues. I know that my colleagues, Tom and Terry, are also engaged in deep battles regarding the census. And so that important work continues. But Jason, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I want to apologize for not being able to stay for the full duration of the program. Tomorrow, I'm going to be offering testimony during the hearing of Amy Coney Barrett, where I'll actually be focusing on voting rights and underscoring why it's so critical that we have a justice in place on the court who will protect and enforce the Voting Rights Act and our nation's other federal civil rights laws. But thank you so much for the privilege to join you today.
Kristen, thank you so much. And we will all be watching tomorrow when you deliver your remarks. And thank you for doing that. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So with that, I will turn it over to Terry.
Great. Thank you, Jason, and thank you to the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice for inviting me to speak on this panel today with my esteemed colleagues. I am Terry Alminis, Senior Director of Census and Voting Programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And I'm going to focus my comments on the Asian American community and issues facing Asian American voters in the upcoming election. Asian American communities are growing rapidly across the country. Census data show that we are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the country, and we are rapidly growing in areas outside of the gateway cities. The last census showed that the 3 states with the largest Asian American populations are California, New York, and Texas, but that the fastest growing communities actually occurred in places like Nevada, Arizona, and North Carolina. With more than 11 million Asian Americans able to vote this year, making up nearly 5% of the nation's eligible voters, Asian Americans are the only major racial or ethnic group in which naturalized citizens, rather than U.S.-born citizens, make up a majority of eligible voters. And this is according to analysis conducted by Pew Research Center. And naturalized citizens make up 1 in 10 U.S. eligible voters in 2020. So while we're excited to see the growing numbers and the potential, right, for increased political, salience, the reality is our communities have yet to maximize our political power. Frankly, there are still challenges facing Asian American voters that keep us from maximizing our political opportunities. We have seen election after election a consistent 15 to 20% gap between Asian American voter participation and that of white voters. For example, the last 2 presidential elections saw eligible Asian Americans registering and voting at around 17% less than eligible white voters. One of the primary reasons for this difference in participation is the language barriers faced by many Asian Americans. Over 70% of Asian Americans speak a language other than English at home. And about a third of Asian Americans are limited English proficient, or LEP, and face some difficulties communicating in English. This language barrier impedes access to the ballots for a number of reasons. First, voting materials are too complex. An analysis of voting materials from all 50 states revealed that they are consistently written at high school or college levels and use complex English. They contain longer sentences or complicated vocabulary and grammar. Voting materials can often be difficult for fluent English speakers, and so you can imagine become that much more difficult for those for whom English is a second language. Second, the voting process is complicated, as Kristen just outlined for us. And so this is especially true for limited English proficient voters who come from countries with a much different democratic system, or maybe some come from countries that don't have a democratic system at all, who now need to figure out how to navigate the daunting and complex election processes in America. Third, Asian American voters with language assistance needs are often actually denied the needed assistance at the polls. And Asian American voters have experienced discrimination through hostile and unwelcoming environments, as well as the blatant denial of their right to vote. So it's really important for Asian American voters generally, but particularly for those who are limited English proficient, to be aware of the rights they have when voting. The Voting Rights Act protects voters against discrimination due to their membership in a language minority group. That is, Asian American voters cannot be discriminated against for having an accent or having some difficulty with English when voting. The Voting Rights Act also provides limited English proficient voters a right to language access. Under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, certain jurisdictions who meet a specific threshold are required to provide language assistance in the covered language throughout the election process through translated written materials, multilingual poll workers at polling locations, and the publication of such assistance to the covered community. I will note, to pick up on the last point that Kristen had made about the importance of census data to voting and to democracy, Section 203 determinations, that is the formula that's used to identify which jurisdictions have to provide this language assistance and for which languages, is absolutely based on census data. And so just yet another way in which census and democracy are tied. For limited English proficient voters who live outside of Section 203 covered jurisdictions, or who frankly are just not eligible for Section 203, because Section 203 only applies to 4 language groups, that is Asian languages, Spanish, American Indian languages, and Alaskan Native languages. Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act actually provides everyone else the right to have someone of their choice assist them in the voting process, to help them with language needs, so long as the person assisting them is not their employer or their union representative. This means Asian American voters anywhere who need language assistance can bring someone with them to the polls to assist them, such as a friend or a relative. So that's sort of generally, the general barriers that have existed for Asian American voters and continue certainly for the 2020 election. The 2020 election, though, of course, has been thrown into chaos because of many different reasons, but in particular, the global coronavirus pandemic, as Kristen had started her comments out with. As we are all working to address the public health and safety needs with respect to the 2020 elections, I think it's important to remember there are specific ways to help ensure limited English proficient voters can access the language assistance they need. We know that the availability of no excuse absentee voting, vote by mail, has increased in the COVID-19 context as a critical way to allow people to vote while maintaining safety. And while it's important that vote by mail is part of the options for people to vote, it's also important that people have the opportunity to vote in person. So voting by mail has been an important option for limited English proficient voters over the years because they have the option to vote from the comfort of their own home. They can take as much time as they need to vote and to feel comfortable in their voting. And also they're able to get language assistance from friends and relatives without necessarily having to coordinate schedules to go to the polls together, as they have a right to under Section 208. And so it made sense, just generally, of course, to expand these opportunities more broadly, but of course, during the pandemic with the concerns around public safety and health, it absolutely made sense to expand these options. And we know that it is important that jurisdictions that are covered under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act must implement vote by mail systems that comply with Section 203, that do offer the same level of access in the covered language as they do in English. And so that's something we're certainly mindful of during this election season. But as I mentioned, vote by mail may not actually work for all limited English proficient voters. And so it's critical to ensure that we have safe in-person options as well. Voting in person for limited English proficient voters actually provides them an opportunity to receive in-person language assistance in the covered jurisdictions at the polls, right? Where you have trained bilingual poll workers who can assist them, whereas perhaps their friends and families, while able to provide translation assistance, may be equally confused about the voting process. Even in non-covered jurisdictions, an LEP voter or limited English proficient voter can bring someone with them to the polls, and they would have access to a trained poll worker who could help walk them through the process of voting if they were to have any questions. So I think another big issue of concern for Advancing Justice AAJC with this upcoming election, though, is the potential increase in voter challenges and voter intimidation against Asian Americans. Really seeing this as an extension of the COVID-19 related anti-Asian sentiment and violence that we've seen to date. Since early this year, we've seen the increased racism and discrimination against Asian Americans who are being wrongly blamed for COVID-19. This discrimination is taking many forms, from hostility and suspicion that Asian Americans are carriers of the coronavirus to verbal abuse, harassment, and even physical violence. I'm sure we've all seen these accounts of serious crimes being reported in the news, such as when several members of an Asian family were stabbed in a Sam's Club parking lot by an individual who believed that the family was Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. We also saw in New York City, a woman, a 89-year-old woman, was attacked and set on fire, and another woman was attacked with acid being thrown at her, right? This has been coupled with the ongoing racist rhetoric from elected officials and their supporters. President Trump and other prominent elected officials continue to use the term Chinese virus, Kung flu, and most recently during the presidential debate, China plague. And as we've tried to speak up to oppose these harmful rhetoric, as many others have, we have encountered pushback that we're being overly sensitive and too concerned with political correctness. Even Representative Grace Meng, who had put, has been a true champion on this issue, has been receiving death threats because of her championing this issue as vociferously and publicly as she has. Now, voter intimidation and harassment of Asian American voters is not a new thing. Voter challenges and voter intimidation have been utilized in the past against Asian Americans based on the harmful stereotype of Asian Americans being the quote unquote perpetual foreigner, and thus assumed to be a non-citizen and voting fraudulently. For example, during the 2004 primary elections in Bayou La Batre, Alabama, we saw supporters of a white incumbent who was facing off with a Vietnamese American opponent. During the primaries, we saw his supporters, the supporters of the white incumbent, challenging the eligibility of only Asian American voters at the polls by falsely accusing them of not being U.S. citizens or city residents. So we know everything has been amped up for this election cycle. White supremacy has been widely acknowledged as one of the main threats to our national security. The reality is white supremacists and white national groups are being encouraged to commit more acts of violence to interfere with the election. These calls to action include encouraging them to go into polls and watch very carefully, and frankly are being heard as a call for voter intimidation, including the use of violence to confront anyone they feel or believe shouldn't be there. So I'm particularly concerned about this confluence of anti-Asian sentiments due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the persistent stereotype of Asian Americans being perpetual foreigners, and the open acceptance of violence against Asian Americans. We also have to be prepared for the to address organized efforts to spread misinformation and disinformation about the elections in our communities. Of course, deceptive practices are also not a new thing. We've heard about the use of billboards, flyers, and robocalls, all providing false information to prevent certain groups from voting in previous elections, right? We know about robocalls in previous elections that told voters that Republicans were supposed to vote on Tuesday and Democrats vote on Wednesday. We've seen flyers that have been distributed in communities of color that have said things like, if you've already voted in any election this year, you can't vote in the presidential election. If anybody in your family has ever been found guilty of anything, you can't vote in the presidential election. If you violate any of these laws, you can get 10 years in prison and your children will get taken away from you. So while these deceptive practices have often been used, though, I think what's particularly pertinent in this time are the advances in technology, and particularly of social media platforms, which has really allowed these practices of misinformation and disinformation really to go further and deeper than they have before, and probably for less cost. And so I think that is certainly something that we are all working to ensure our communities are well aware of their rights, to help combat against some of these efforts to promote misinformation and disinformation, and to make sure that our community members feel well equipped to participate in the upcoming election. So at Advancing Justice AAJC, we have an Election 2020 webpage at advancingjustice-aajc.org/election 2020. We have a series of informational fact sheets, many of them translated into 11 Asian languages. We recognize the importance of making sure that our materials are linguistically and culturally accessible for our community members. We also run an Asian language election protection hotline in partnership with API Vote, and we've done so since 2012. Our hotline, 888-API-VOTE, provides assistance to voters in English and 8 Asian languages: Cantonese, Mandarin, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali. It's available year-round to answer questions and assist with problems, and is a part of the Lawyers Committee's suite of hotlines. You know, with this hotline, we're happy to help people figure out whether they're registered, how they can register, where their polling place is located, and other common problems. And we can also assist if they encounter problems at the polls, whether from a hostile poll worker to issues around long lines and missing translated ballots. We'd like to say there are no questions too big or too small. And we are pushing out all of this information and these resources to our community members to help try to make sure that everyone, much like we were trying to make sure everyone got counted in the census, everyone who's eligible to vote is actually able to vote this election. So I think I will stop there, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thanks so much, Terry. We really appreciate it. I'm sure there will be some questions. Before that, let's turn it over to Tom. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to the ABA for putting together this important program. And thank you to my colleagues for covering so many issues, making it a little easier for me to follow up. But I want to begin where you began, Jason. You identified this as perhaps the most critical election of our lifetimes, and I think that's absolutely true. There are many who would argue that every presidential election is critical, but I think there is reason to believe that this one may be more important than others. But there's certainly something about which I think there is little debate. This is likely to be the most contentious election we see in our lifetimes, at least up till now. And I want to identify some of the reasons why, because they do relate to voting rights. I think what we have seen in this election, and we have not seen necessarily in prior elections, at least to the extent we're seeing it today, is voting rights issues and voting rights litigation becoming part of the partisan battleground. I think we have seen in this election, to a far greater degree than previously, some of that has ties to the specific circumstances of this election that both of my colleagues have addressed, but certainly it also relates to a development in the law. The organizations that Kristen, Terry, and I come from have always pursued voting rights as a non-partisan issue. When we go into court, we're as likely, I would say, certainly in Maldef's experience, to be opposing Democratic office holders on the other side as we are to be opposing Republican office holders. So we have always strived in our organizations, nonprofits that are required by law to be nonpartisan, to really ensure that our pursuit of voting rights objectives in court is viewed by everyone, and perhaps most importantly by the judge or judges who decide these issues, as a decidedly nonpartisan issue about guaranteeing the fundamental right to vote to every person, including in particular voters of color. But what we have seen in the lead up to this November's election is that both parties have been involved in numerous cases involving the assertion of voting rights, either increasing access or seeking to restrict access under a guise of defending either states' rights, states' prerogatives, or under the guise of protecting the right to protect against voter fraud. I think there's very little, as I think has been discussed previously, to support any widespread allegations of voter fraud. But my point here really is that we see more party involvement in these voting rights issues, and I expect that to continue. Indeed, in future elections, it may be an almost expected element of a partisan campaign to be involved in litigating, or at least threatening to litigate, certain voting rights issues. And that is a new development that's worthy of note this year, in contrast to prior elections in prior years. Obviously, what makes this election so contentious is not just that engagement in litigation, but an expectation that the presidential election may be close, an expectation on the part of some more or less openly articulated in recent years, even if it had not been in prior years, that restricting the vote of some would actually lead to a change in the outcome of an election, whether that's presidential or one of the other many important races on ballots around the country. That has always been, to many of us, an obvious reason for some of the measures that have been taken in the name of voter fraud, a recognition that if you reduce the vote of particular communities, you can help to skew the outcome in favor of the candidates supported by other communities. But I think there's been a more open articulation of that in recent years, and that is part of what makes this election contentious as well. So we all expect the battles around voting rights and around access to the ballot, and more importantly, as I'll expand in a minute, around having your ballot counted to continue through election day and beyond. And that has always been an element of every election, but it seems to be on steroids with this election, where we can anticipate that there will be battles on these issues up to and beyond the election in virtually every region of the country. So it's important to note once more what Kristen noted. This is the second presidential election that we will be conducting without the protections of preclearance. She mentioned the decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 by a 5-4 decision of the US Supreme Court that struck down the coverage formula for preclearance obligations under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The effect of striking down that coverage formula is to mean that none of the jurisdictions that previously would have been required to get prior approval, any elections related changes they make, no longer have that obligation. And I think it's important to note that that Shelby County decision has immediate impact as we approach an election. I think folks who are aware of preclearance sometimes think about it, and as they should, in relation to big changes like drawing and redrawing lines in the redistricting period following every census, or implementing a new voter ID provision, or implementing a new provision requiring proof of citizenship before you're allowed to register. And yes, these big changes were certainly subject to preclearance. But it's important to remember that the covered jurisdictions, which included many states in the South, as well as the entire states of Alaska, Arizona, and Texas, and pockets, regions, counties, pieces of other states around the country. But the preclearance jurisdictions also were required to take what might appear to be more minor changes through the preclearance regime. And that meant, for example, that even moving a polling place or consolidating two voting precincts, which often has an impact on the day of an election, when someone who wants to vote shows up at the place that they've voted for the last decade or longer and finds that that's no longer a polling place and their polling place has been moved, or finds that their precinct has been consolidated with another and they've got to go a further distance across town to find where it is that they are allowed to vote. Even those relatively minor changes were subject to preclearance. And that meant that in elections prior to 2013, that many jurisdictions around the country would have to plan in advance for those kinds of changes, submit them to the Department of Justice or the US District Court in DC for preclearance, or otherwise they could not move forward with making those changes. So we are approaching this election without that protection in place. That I think is important to note, because we do expect there to be contentious issues around access to a polling place for those who choose to vote in person, just as we have seen plenty of contention in the courts, as my colleagues have detailed, around access to remote voting. One quick note about remote voting. It is important to remember that those jurisdictions, and there are many, that still require one of a limited set of reasons to qualify to vote by mail, including most notably our second most populous state, the state of Texas, where you have to satisfy one of a limited list of reasons to get the opportunity to vote by mail, that in those states that do not have no excuse remote voting, that often has a discriminatory effect on communities like the Latino community that MALDEF regularly represents. The reason is that our community tends to be younger than other communities, and often the reasons that provide for you to receive the opportunity to vote by mail tie to age or disability. And to the extent that we are a younger community with less disabilities, that means that the Latino community has less of an opportunity to vote by mail, which is particularly important under a pandemic that affects all people more or less equally. Indeed, we've seen discriminatory effects, disparities, particularly striking communities of color under this pandemic. Second point I really want to emphasize as we go into this election is that the voting rights season with respect to this election, just like the election itself, will extend beyond November 3rd. Oftentimes we've been used in the past to deciding things on the date of the election and everything is resolved. But the truth is, particularly in local elections where there might be close races, there was often a post-election canvassing period, particularly if there was a recount or there was a close enough election that counting the remote ballots by mail could be outcome determinative. There was often contention around whose ballots would be counted. I think in the context of a pandemic where there will be much larger numbers of folks voting remotely, either voting by mail or taking a previously completed ballot and taking it to an election drop-off location, that count will continue for many days after November 3rd. And there will be contention about whose ballot legitimately counts. That includes complying with some of the state-by-state rules that Kristen identified. Did the person's signature match their registration? Did they have an indication that it was witnessed where that is required? Did they have an indication that it was notarized where that is required? So contention about whose ballots count will be a major part of this election, continuing past November 3rd and involving the voting rights issues that we've been discussing. The final thing I want to mention is voting rights concerns that are beyond the election. And Kristen talked a bit about the census and the truncation of the collection period that the administration had upheld basically in an unsigned decision by the US Supreme Court yesterday. But there are two other issues that both AAJC, Terry's organization, and MALDEF, my organization, continue to litigate regarding the census that affects voting rights in the future. We still have this indication by the Trump administration that it intends to discount entirely undocumented immigrants in using census figures from 2020 to reapportion the House of Representatives. After every census, we reassign the 435 seats in the US House of Representatives, giving more seats to states that grew relatively more quickly, more significantly, and taking seats away from some of the states that grew far less vigorously than those states. That has always been done since at least the Civil War, and the enactment of the 14th Amendment has been done based on total state population. But this year, the Trump administration has indicated an intent to take those total state population figures, require the Census Bureau to provide also an estimate of the undocumented immigrant population state by state, and then to subtract those numbers of undocumented immigrants from the count before turning over the population count for reapportioning the House to the House of Representatives. That obviously has voting rights implications for the states that may lose seats as a result of the subtraction of an undocumented immigrant population. That case is being litigated as we speak and may end up, it's also very likely to end up before the US Supreme Court. And finally, we continue to litigate the intended creation by the Trump administration of a citizenship database. This was by executive order after they lost the citizenship question, and the Supreme Court indicated it would have to be removed after it was late added to the 2020 census form. In response, the Trump administration issued an order requiring the creation through administrative records maintained by federal and state government of a citizenship database. The sole purpose of creating that database is then to distribute it to the states and other jurisdictions engaging in redistricting, the redrawing of district lines following the 2020 census. And all of that will occur next year in 2021. But providing the citizenship database will permit jurisdictions that choose to attempt to equalize population between districts based on voter population rather than total population. This notion of equalizing voter population rather than total population has been promoted by certain right-wing forces for many, many years. And this database would provide the opportunity for any jurisdiction that chose to, though they would certainly be sued and subject to litigation, but for any district that chose to attempt to equalize their districts based on voter population rather than total population. And interestingly, the state of Missouri has a measure on its November 3rd ballot that would potentially require the state of Missouri to do exactly that, to draw its legislative and other districts to equalize voter population rather than total population. Important to note that voter population districts not only exclude immigrants not yet naturalized, the citizenship database, but also would exclude anyone under the age of 18 from being counted in drawing those legislative districts. So this is a forecast of voting rights issues that are being decided and litigated right now as we move up to this contentious election that have ramifications not just in 2021 when reapportionment occurs and when redistricting occurs, but for the entirety of the next decade. So I will end there, and I look forward to joining my colleague Terry in answering the questions about this upcoming contentious election and the other looming voting rights issues we have ahead. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. And thank you again, Terry. So there have been a few questions that have been coming in. Some of them can somewhat be grouped into a couple categories. So I'll do my best to try to group them a little bit. There have been claims of voter fraud. You all have touched on it before. Tom, I think you had really dismissed those claims, debunked it. I think that, experts say that really this does not exist. There are concerns, though, at a different level raised about drop boxes, raised about ballot collections, and every state has different rules, as you all mentioned. And specifically, we saw Texas with one drop box per county. I was hoping, on behalf of our attendees, that you both would be willing to talk a little bit about the importance of these sort of ballot collection methods that exist outside of the Postal Service and outside of in-person voting, and how that might play into any concerns about the fact that the ballots would be counted correctly or otherwise.
Thanks, Jason. Let me start. Let me first say once more that, as you've said, the allegations of widespread voter fraud are simply not supported by any study or any indication. We should all recall that 4 years ago, when he lost the popular vote, Donald Trump asserted that the millions of votes that separated him from Hillary Clinton, popular votes, were a result of voter fraud, he suggested, primarily by immigrants, not yet citizens, in the Latino community. He then created an election integrity task force that was led by Vice President Mike Pence, that was chaired by then Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. But he then sunsetted that task force a few months later in the dead of night on a Friday, I believe, because they couldn't actually put together anything to support the allegations of fraud. We see those allegations recurring in the specific context of this election from Donald Trump again, asserting that somehow voting by mail or remote voting is subject to great amounts of fraud. Interestingly, of course, he himself has voted by mail a number of times in the past, but he is now asserting that widespread remote voting is subject to fraud. Again, I think it's important to note there is absolutely no indication, even though remote voting, pandemic aside, has been increasing over years and years, particularly in states like my state, California, where there's no excuse remote voting. As it has increased, there is no indication of voter fraud occurring because of remote voting. The issue you raise about the opportunity first to turn in a ballot in a safe way, given public health guidelines, and have it counted does relate to the creation of these drop boxes, these official centers where you can drop off a ballot rather than using the mail, where people have concerns that ballots might be delayed and therefore not counted. That's important so that folks don't have to go to their polling place on election day, where there might be lines, there might be crowds that violate public health guidelines, but can, in advance of the election or on election day, go to an official drop center or drop box to submit their ballot. That's very important. But in many states, that's going to be inadequate. You've noted, Jason, that in Texas, the governor recently decided that each county, regardless of size or population, could have only one drop center for ballots. That obviously has a tremendous impact in the hugely populated centers like Harris County or in the city of Dallas, the city of Austin, et cetera. Where you can only have one, it's going to make it more difficult for folks to turn in their ballots. In that context and in others, there are efforts by organizations on both sides to harvest ballots where it is permitted. And that is in many ways a way of ensuring that folks have a safe and convenient way of making sure their ballot is submitted and therefore counted. But ballot harvesting does raise concerns for some that those doing the harvesting may selectively decide to leave certain ballots out, or may decide to leave all the ballots in the box and not turn them in to those who are actually doing the ballot counting. Those are legitimate concerns. That's why it's so important to have official drop boxes, official voting centers to drop off a ballot that are widely available. But when our states don't provide that, that's when these issues definitely arise. And I'll allow Terry to say more, of course.
I'm gonna have to say I think Tom covered it exquisitely, and I know there are a lot of questions in the queue, so I will cede back my time.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Tom. There was another interesting question, and we had seen some reports as well about the racial disparities that result from some of the restrictions or requirements placed on mail-in balloting. For one example, I believe there was in North Carolina a study done where there was a pretty sharp racial disparity in ballots that were thrown out due to signature matches. And I was wondering if both of you would be able to comment on the impact of some of these requirements and some of these qualifications in the states that might seem to some voters as being completely okay or not problematic, but actually do pose significant problems for various communities in our country.
Sure. So I'll start. I think that absolutely some of these rules that are neutral on their face can be problematic and can have disparate impacts on different communities. I'll say, for example, in the Asian American community, names can be problematic, right? Since our population is highly immigrant, right? I think I mentioned over 70% of our community or over 60% of our community is born in another country. the way names are standardized might not be the same, right? So you may have, for example, in some communities where the last name is actually comes first before, traditionally, as you would think of it here. And so the way names show up in different databases could be different, just based on how people input that information. And so when you're looking at things like matching, there are problems and issues. Additionally, even if you don't have those kind of switch up concerns and errors, you're also not talking about, I guess, common names that are seen here. And so there may be letters that get switched, right? Because it's not, John, I know how to spell John, there are so many ways to spell John. But if it's something where you may have 2 or 3 vowels that are, successive upon each other, it's not inconceivable that somebody inputting information may switch that up and just have a different placement of letters. And once all of those changes or all of those incorrect processing and the incorrect information will cause a mismatch to occur, even when it really isn't a mismatch. So I think that's just one example of how some of these rules can be problematic.
So I'll just say there's a range of ways of verifying that a remotely passed ballot is genuine. And the most draconian that you heard Kristen mention, like requiring notarization, certainly have a disparate impact, because that is a disparate impact based on income. It certainly has a disparate impact on the availability of a notary for someone to call upon. Even requirements like having a witness can sometimes have a disparate impact, particularly if you have folks who are reluctant to act as a witness for whatever reason. And this may have to do with distrust of government, and sometimes that does occur in particular communities, again, skewing based on income and often based on race. I would say the best and most appropriate means of verifying that a ballot is genuine is through a signature match, right? You need something to ensure that a third party is not submitting a ballot for someone else. The problem with signature matches is that people's signatures change over time. So the signature you had when you registered, which may have been decades ago, may be dramatically different from the signature you have today. And if you haven't gone in and re-registered because your signature has changed, there's going to be a signature match problem, which is where the best and most facilitating way to address that is to ensure that a voter is informed that there's a signature mismatch, and then is given an opportunity to cure, to basically come in or otherwise indicate, it really was me, my signature has changed, sorry that it didn't match what I gave you decades ago. But not all states provide that opportunity to cure. And I expect that that's one of the issues that may end up being litigated across the country after November 3rd, as we get into that battle I described over not who had access to a ballot, but who, having cast a ballot, is actually going to have their ballot counted. So the ability to cure and facilitating that is critical to ensuring broad voter participation when you have remote voting.
Great. Thank you, Tom. We are at time. I'm sure we could probably talk many more hours on this. But Terry, Tom, Kristen, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to speak to all of us about the issues related to the election. Shameless plug time. For those of you that are attending, join the ABA. Don't just join the ABA, join the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. You'll be able to participate and even help plan some of these very important and timely webinars. You could go online for more information about the section. ambar.org/join-CRSJ. They make me spell out the actual address. I'll just end with this. A couple of years ago, John Lewis received the section's Thurgood Marshall Award. It's a Lifetime Achievement Award, and he spoke via video conference to all of us, and he was very clear. He said, we need the law to be on the side of the people. We need members of the bar more than ever before to find a way to get in the way, to get in good trouble, necessary trouble. So we'll leave you with that. Find a way to get involved with this upcoming election. Vote. Help one of these fantastic organizations in a nonpartisan way protect the vote. And thank you very much, and look forward to seeing everyone again soon.